ask, what is your initial reaction to the events of the day?
Well, we learned something really important today at the hearing, the idea that the Council of Economic Advisors, Stephen Miran, would go over to the Federal Reserve as a governor and remain on the payroll of the president of the White House. That's unprecedented. And of course, he said many times that he vowed to be an independent voice. But I think the members of the committee correctly really pressed him on how could he be an independent voice if he's still working for the president and may, in fact, go back to his old job in several months' time. So that was a very important piece of information. Of course, it comes in the context where the White House is mounting an unprecedented attack on the independence of the Federal Reserve more broadly, summarily firing a member of the board, pressuring the chair. So that was a very important hearing today.
Well, I'd love to just explore this a little bit with you, because the idea that he's going to still effectively be a White House employee in a political position, even though he will not be taking his pay. He was asked about this a couple of times, and Stephen Miran said that that was the advice of legal counsel. When asked if he would simply resign on his own, he didn't really answer that question. So it looks like this is happening, Lael Brainard, and if he is in fact confirmed, what will that arrangement mean for the Fed? We won't trust anything he says?
It's a really important unprecedented arrangement. We just haven't seen this. And of course, why does it matter that the Federal Reserve takes decisions based on analysis in a way that is independent of the White House? Because when the Federal Reserve is not independent, as we saw in the 1970s, inflation goes up and long-term interest rates go up, mortgages become more expensive. So it's very much in the interest of American consumers and the American economy to make sure that those members of the Federal Reserve can make their independent assessments. If you're on the payroll of the White House, it's really hard to see how you do that.
Would you not trust his word if he stayed?
Well, I think the question is whether, more broadly, the credibility of the Fed as an inflation-fighting institution would be really at stake here. And the question is, do the broader markets view the Fed as compromised?
We've seen snippets of that in the markets, but not a full-out panic just yet that we've seen in certain other iterations. Donald Trump used the word getting a majority on the Federal Reserve in a cabinet meeting. Walk us through just what the impact of that kind of framing has on the institution.
Well, of course, the Federal Reserve Board has 7 members, and so it requires 4 members to get a majority. And those votes that are taken on monetary policy help to determine interest rates. Of course, he said very clearly he'd like to see lower interest rates. Loads of presidents want to see lower interest rates, but getting a majority gets him in a position to affect that. And one of the things that I think has never been at issue before is that all of the other members of the Monetary Policy Setting Committee, all of the Reserve Bank presidents, are up for reappointment in February. And so having a majority on the board could actually affect the composition of the broader Monetary Policy Setting Committee. That would be another really serious threat to the independence.
You mentioned President Trump's efforts to fire one of the Fed governors, in this case Lisa Cook, whose lawyer today, as we wait for a ruling from the court, her lawyer Abby Lowell was out with a statement saying the questions over how Governor Cook described her properties from time to time, which have started to address the pending case and will continue to do so, are not fraud. But it takes nothing for this DOJ to undertake a new politicized investigation. And there's a criminal investigation now, which was a pretty important headline today. ProPublica is out with reporting that we talked about with Michael McKee, that 3 members at least of President Trump's cabinet are also facing allegations of mortgage fraud, if we want to call it that. In this case, 2 primary residences. You've been in Washington for a minute. This isn't unusual around here, is it?
No. I think what's important, though, is because of the independence of the Federal Reserve and the connection it has to having a strong economy with low inflation and low interest rates, that what matters here is making sure there's a really good process. As you know, the Federal Reserve board members are not supposed to be fired except for cause. And since that has never happened before, it seems like it would be extremely important for any White House, if they wanted to show that they cared about the Fed's credibility in fighting inflation, to go through a lengthy process before firing somebody and showing the cause. That hasn't happened here. And so it's that lack of due process, the urgency to fire a board member in order to secure the majority, that is so unusual and should have markets a bit rattled about whether the Fed can be independent.
Why do you think the markets aren't as rattled as maybe they have been in previous iterations?
Well, I think as we've seen in many examples around the world, often it takes a little while for market participants, investors, to digest just how significant they consider these moves to be. But when markets move, they do tend to move. And they may underreact for a while, but they can overreact at a point in time. And so it's not clear what it would take to see that kind of move. But of course, when the initial announcement of the firing was made, we did see the directional pattern that the dollar weakened and long-term interest rates went up. And so that does suggest that investors are watching this set of developments very carefully. And as we know, again, in the 1970s here in the U.S., as we saw in the U.K., markets will force long-term interest rates up if they believe that the central bank no longer has credibility on fighting inflation.
You know, whether it's Lisa Cook we're talking about or the commissioner of BLS, or now President Trump is asking the Supreme Court to let him fire the FTC commissioner. That is a headline from just a couple of hours ago this afternoon. What do you make of this broad attempt, the president, to reshape government in his own likeness?
Well, we certainly have seen across the independent agencies a very aggressive executive branch asserting the prerogative of getting rid of people who have terms that extend well into this president's term in office, asserting executive authority to do that. And it will be up to the Supreme Court to see exactly where they are going to draw the line. So far, they've been somewhat sympathetic to the president's overreach. And the other thing, of course, that will be important to see when this does, if this does go to the Supreme Court, is whether they again draw a distinction between other independent agencies and the Federal Reserve, because that will tell us a little bit about how they are likely to view the current fight at the Federal Reserve.